Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Crash Course, where we will be discussing one of the historical time periods of the United States history. I'm your host, Dakota Burwell.
And I am your co-host, Aanya. Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today as we will be covering Historical Period 4. This historical period is set between the years of 1800 and 1848.
Wow, 48 years of history. Comparing to the time that the United States started, this period is really short.
Well, yes, but a significant amount of events took place within these 48 years. Why don't you help us gain some insight into understanding how our first concept began to develop during this time period?
Well, we start off with the historical period, the growing political divide after the War of 1812. Henry Clay pushed his American system, which had high tariffs to fund internal improvements and fuel our American industry, and a national bank to bring up the commerce. This would benefit the North, who could easily manufacture their own products, but the South would be hurt by it because they required manufactured goods from outside sources like Britain and were forced to pay the higher prices. South Carolina nullified the tariff Andrew Jackson passed, so he came back with the Force Act of 1833, which allowed him to use the Army and Navy to collect taxes. We also see Jackson's fiscal plan repel industries, so the North leans towards the Whigs because they have more industry, and the South leans more towards Democrats, which leads the Democrats pro-slavery.
Next, the Second Great Awakening. This is a religious revival movement during the 19th century. It included anti-slavery movements, women's suffrage, and temperance. The movement was prompted by a falling interest in religion due to the fact that the population gradually showed more interest in the innovations of the Industrial Revolution and the rapid expansion of the U.S. territories. People did not have the time or the inclination for worship. Therefore, due to this awakening, the revivalist meetings ignited the interest in religion. It also influenced moral and social reforms and inspired utopian and other religious movements.
We see religious and intellectual movements during this time period coming from the Great Awakening, and that's mostly led by all of the people promoting more science and intellectual sorts of ideas that were similar to the religion. And it largely incorporates a lot of black movements also, because that's the same exact movements, the same exact way that the Africans like to promote their free rights.
Speaking of movements, African American Southern movements also took place in the 19th century. Abolitionist and anti-slavery movements gradually achieved emancipation in the North, contributing to the growth of the free African American population. Even as many state governments restricted African Americans' rights, anti-slavery efforts in the South were largely limited to unsuccessful slave rebellions. The slave revolt that had been led by Nat Turner in Virginia of August of 1831 was the most terrifying. Turner's rebellion initiated debate over abolishing slavery after the uprising, but instead enacted new slave codes to prevent future uprisings. Nat Turner is regarded as a hero by a large number of black people worldwide. No slave uprising, before or after the incident, had inflicted such a blow on the ranks of slaveholders and their families in the United States. Also, from the 1830s to the 1860s, the movement to abolish slavery in America gained strength, led by free blacks such as Frederick Douglass and white supporters such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, who published the first best-selling anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Another development during this time period is the women's rights movement. They faced harsh criticism from both men and some conservative women also. They argued that since African Americans were obtaining similar rights, they should too. Women were second-class citizens at this time and were not put into the education systems like men, so they pushed for more opportunities in school and for work, since they were mostly staying at their house and doing their house duties. We also see Amelia Jinks Bloomer, which was a feminist, create her special Bloomer clothes named after her, but they were not very popular due to a lot of criticism coming from opposition to the feminist movement.
Let's talk about new technology and transportation methods. Innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce powerfully accelerated the American economy. This overall dramatically expanded manufacturing and agricultural productions. There were two significant innovations that changed daily life in the 19th century: steam and electricity. the development and application of steam engines and electricity to various tasks such as transportation and the telegraph. Trains had been the main use of transportation. In 1852, the first railroad tracks were laid in Ohio. In terms of communication, there was a telegraph service for people to communicate through before the invention of telephones that came around 1900. Other forms of communication in the 19th century included writing by paper and pencil, newspapers, and storytelling. Other technological innovations that were significant during this time had been the earliest washing machine, which had been a washboard called the scrubboard.
There was also an economic and market revolution during this time period that changed how the U.S. faced economy. We see Henry Clay's American system take hold with its internal improvements fueled by high tariffs that also promote domestic trade. There is also a lot of southern divide from this because their differing economic situation, which favors the lower tariffs. Jackson's fiscal plan also caused the crisis of 1837, where unemployment rose and wages, profits, and prices went down.
In addition to economy, an increase in trade occurred during this period of time. The beginning of industrialization had already begun to change the price of labor and the distribution of wealth that defined markets. New technological innovations further altered the price of labor and goods, and also, as a result, changed the cost of trade. First, mechanization reduced the cost of human labor, making slave labor being transported from Africa to the Americas more expensive. Second, manufacturing output increased. There was an even greater search for markets to produce the new goods. Third, the creation of financial institutions, including joint stock companies, credit systems, etc., made it possible to produce larger commercial enterprises than ever before. With all of the growth in trade, government trade policies changed as well. During the early 19th century, European governments attempted to organize the Atlantic trade by granting royal charters to their citizens that guaranteed them a monopoly on trade within a region, in exchange for a payment to the government.
We also see the Missouri Compromise, allowing Missouri into the United States as a slave state, only if every state below its southern border, the 36th parallel, would become a slave state, and every state north of that border would become a free state. We see the North and the South clashing as the North keeps pushing for abolition of slavery and the South keeps pushing for more states to be allowed into the United States as slave states. And we see that there's a lot of African American movements trying to push back for abolition and people trying to solve that problem because we have an increasing number of freed blacks and we try to send them to Liberia, but that doesn't work because they're trying to push for civil rights as women were at the time also.
Lastly, the Monroe Doctrine that also took place in this historical period. There was still British colonization happening in the West, thus President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 as a warning. It stated that the United States would not tolerate colonization. By kicking Britain out, the United States solidified itself as the dominant superpower in the world.
Development during this time that we can see is Manifest Destiny. Coming out of the religious movements, it caused Christians and people in the United States to spread west, which was really bad for the Indians and the native Mexicans that were living there. So we see a lot of Mexican-American War, and we also see Polk trying to push for the Oregon, Washington state. At the time it was just the Oregon Territory, with the 54-40 or war, but all that came out of that was the 49th parallel, which is where we are today. I also find that there's a lot of immigrants coming from Europe, and it mostly is the Germans and the Irish are the big two that are coming here. The Irish kind of stay on the East Coast, and they are very largely shunned by a lot of people just because their demeanor and nobody really likes them. And we see the Germans kind of push towards more western rural areas and start farming because that's all they knew at the time. Here's a list of Supreme Court cases during this historical period number 4. We see Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge in 1833, this debate over whether the federal law was unconstitutional or not. And it was overturned, and it was significant because judicial review is established. And we see Fletcher versus Peck In 1810, a constitutional state law and sanctioned contract, contract state laws are overturned. Significance is the precedence of Supreme Court judging state laws.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Crash Course with Historical Period 4. We will see you next week with Historical Period 5.